Among several growing dangers of new wars under the Trump administration, tensions seem to be intensifying most quickly with the one that's also a nuclear power. Just weeks after the 72nd anniversary of the U.S. nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Trump confronted North Korea with some of the most overtly genocidal threats I've ever heard.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly power, the likes of which this world has never seen before. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
Trump has doubled down on the ruthlessness of the official White House statement with several unhinged tweets threatening nuclear annihilation. In one, saying his nuclear button is, quote, much bigger and more powerful than Kim Jong-un's. The Trump cabinet has even drafted war plans plotting a first strike against North Korea's nuclear sites. The threats have escalated alongside other modes of attack, including harsh new sanctions on the Korean economy. Despite the immense gravity of a U.S. war drive on the peninsula, Trump has seen little resistance from the self-appointed resistance led by the Democratic Party. But the bipartisan support for attacking a sovereign nation only exists among those privileged elites who will profit from such a war. The people of the United States, despite being bombarded with fear-mongering propaganda, think much differently than the millionaires who supposedly represent them. Throughout Asia and the United States alike, many have been holding protests denouncing the threats. The Empire Files attended one of those actions in Los Angeles.
I'm out here because President Trump's fire and fury statement, and also he stand on the UN podium, says total destruction to the North Korea. So we are denouncing his statement also. Tell him that he's not welcome in Korea.
We civil society groups from the United States, South Korea, and Japan call for a diplomatic solution to the dangerous conflict between the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
트럼프가 평화를 위협하고 제3차 세계대전이 일어날 수 있을 수 있는 그런 망언들을 늘어놓기 때문에 한반도에 살고 있는 한 사람으로서 이 자리에 있는 것입니다.
I am Korean. I was born in Korea and I immigrated here when I was 2. And you know, growing up in the U.S., I remember kids always asking me, what are you? Where are you from, right? And this didn't bother me much because, you know, I'm Korean and I'm proud to be Korean. But then they'd ask me, are you North Korean or South Korean? And although I do not identify along this imposed unnatural divide, I tell them, oh, my family's from South Korea. And then they'd reassure me and say, oh, okay, South Korea is good. South Korea is our friend. North Korea is our enemy. And I'd be thinking, wow, really? Like, we're 8 years old. How do you already have an enemy of an entire nation that you probably can't even find on a map?
And we're here for one purpose. That purpose is to say that we will not accept another imperialist United States war.
Despite what the media has been saying recently, reopening war against Korea is not inevitable. But if we want peace in Korea, we need to demand the powers that be here to end the sanctions, stop the threats, de-escalate, sign a peace treaty, and get the goddamn U.S. military out of Korea.
They said always North Korea is a provoke to South Korea and the neighboring country, but they always on the defense mode. U.S. is the only country that use the nukes, have about 6,000 of nukes. This is a matter of North Koreans and South Korean people's life and death. Because nuclear war is no winner.
With a U.S. administration that continuously does the unthinkable, I sat down with journalist and expert in U.S.-Korea relations, Tim Shorrock, to learn what's being totally left out of the debate in the U.S. media and in Washington. Everyone talks about North Korea, of course, as this police state dictatorship, and that's why it's our enemy, right? And South Korea is our ally because it shares our Western values of democracy and freedom. Do you agree with that?
Until, the late 1980s, South Korea was a pretty dark dictatorship too. And, the United States supported a succession of police states there. After Syngman was overthrown, there was about 1 year of a somewhat progressive government in 1960 to 61 that wanted to, start talking about unification. It wasn't that far after the division and the terrible, impact of the Korean War. But 1961, there's a military coup. Park Chung-hee, former general trained by the Japanese imperial forces, he took over as the military dictator in South Korea, and we supported that government until his assassination in 1979 with huge amounts of military aid. Pak government supported the U.S., sent troops to Vietnam to back the U.S. war in southern Vietnam. And so, we had this relationship with a succession of dictatorial governments in the South. And the Park Chung-hee government talking about, talk about a police state, talk about a surveillance state, talk about a torture state, and yet we poured hundreds of millions of dollars into supporting them and against the will of the Korean people. And there was another military coup in 1980 that was another general took over after Park was killed. And, he took power by killing hundreds of people in the southwestern city of Gwangju. And, even when there was an uprising against that military coup against martial law forces, the U.S. Worked with the Korean military to put down the uprising. And, this was really shocking to a lot of South Koreans, and people felt very betrayed. And they finally stood up and won their democracy in the late 1980s, 1987, 1988. So, until then, that whole myth was not applicable. But I think the reason that we're in the United States still has massive amounts of military forces in South Korea is not just North Korea. I mean, the ideology for having troops there has changed. I mean, they're important for the U.S. military. It's important to have forward basing in Asia. The United States has very strong military presence in Japan and Okinawa, as you know. And most of the U.S. bases in Japan are in Okinawa, and those are seen as forward bases for the U.S. to project power in Asia and throughout the world, really. So the rationale has sort of changed.
I was going to ask, the enemy of the state laws and kind of the repression of political dissidents, are those holdovers from these military dictatorships that you were talking about?
Yeah, they are. South Korea has a law called the National Security Law, under which if you say anything that sounds like it's what North Korea says, you can be jailed, and you can be jailed for having North Korean literature. You can be jailed for traveling there without authority from the South Korean government, and so lots of people have been persecuted under this national security law. In the past, it was used as a way to just stifle dissent, period. And lots of people during the Park period, Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan period, were executed under the national security law. There was lots of trumped up charges just on this loose law that said, if you say anything that's close to what North Korea says, you're a communist and you're a pro-North Korean, therefore you're to be prosecuted. I mean, under Park Chung-hee, there was cases of, there'd be a group of people that might have studied Marxism or something, and they would like, all 30 of them, they would charge them all with anti-state, on violations under the national security law.
Horrific.
Many of those people back in the 70s were executed. And, people spent decades in prison under this law, and this law is still in place. And a lot of people in South Korea feel like South Korea can't really be a truly democratic country until it gets rid of this law. Actually, when I was in Gwangju recently, There was a man who was there who actually took part in the uprising in 1980, and he was arrested in the 80s under one of these trumped-up cases under the national security law. And he spent, I think it was 14 years in prison. And under the national security law, even after you're released from prison, you have to report to the police once or twice a year, and you have to tell them everything that you did that might violate the national security law, and also anyone you know that may have violated the national security law. This is still if you're still now, and once you're out of prison. And he refused to do that. He said he thinks that violates his conscience and it violates South Korea's democracy. And he is now on trial for violating that part of the law. So it's still, it's still something that's, very undemocratic about it.
North Korea, of course, or the DPRK, is a country that essentially the media can say anything about it, and people believe it because it's so closed off, right? And I've heard stories, everything from mass, cannibalization to Kim Jong-un, who has his forces just execute people who aren't crying hard enough at like military parades. I mean, it's comical, the amount of disinfo. Do you care to debunk any common misconceptions about the country?
Well, the most common misperception is that the leadership is crazy and irrational. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing crazy and irrational about trying to, defend your country from what you consider to be, a military force that's out to destroy you. I mean, that's totally rational. And I think, building nuclear weapons, when you look out at the world and you see what happened, say, when in Libya to Gaddafi, when he gave up his nuclear program, and then a few years later, U.S. and NATO, displaced him in a war, and put in a government that's completely chaotic now, and he sees this happening when he, to a leader who did give up his weapons. Well, that's even more of a reason to hold on to your nuclear weapons. So that's one thing that people should be disabused of. There's nothing crazy or irrational about their leadership. People in North Korea have the same kind of wants and desires that people all over the world do. To live in safety and to have a good health system and to have jobs and income and water and food, everything. The people are no different, North and South in Korea. There's no reason to gloss over the nature of the authoritarian state in North Korea, because it's present. We know that there's many political prisoners, but the country has developed over time. It's come back from, it was pretty much destroyed in the Korean War. They have pride in their economic developments. I mean, this is a country that was destroyed at one point. Within 20 years, it had a very flourishing economy. And North Korea had a kind of interesting history as a socialist country, because it didn't, it had this philosophy of Kim Il-sung's philosophy was, self-reliance, called Juche, and developed their own self-sufficient economy. And so they didn't want to be integrated into the world market. So North Korea developed their own, industry, without being dependent on any one country. And they were very proud of it, And you can see the fact that, a country that can develop a nuclear weapon and also develop very sophisticated missiles is not a backward country. And they maintain a certain degree of independence from all their allies. And when you go to Korea, North or South, the only foreign troops in Korea are in the South, or U.S. forces. There's no Chinese forces in North Korea. There's no Russian forces in North Korea. They withdrew, soon after the Korean War ended in 1953. The other critical thing that Americans really need to know is that yes, it's their country. It was split arbitrarily. It should never have been split. Dean Rusk, who was a low-level State Department guy, walked into a room and looked at a map of Korea and saw the 38th parallel on the map, a National Geographic map, and said, we'll divide it right there. And so it was completely arbitrary, and there was supposed to be, a unified Korea after that, and that was just supposed to be temporary. But, it didn't turn out to be that way.
Let's move on to the Korean War. when I grew up in school, you know, you hear about World War I, World War II, Vietnam, of course, but you don't really learn much about this war. It's called the Hidden War for a reason, but we're nonetheless taught that the U.S. was forced to respond because of this invasion of the South by the North. What really happened?
Well, the origins of the Korean War go back to that division in 1945. Throughout the country, there had been, you know, sort of these people committees were formed throughout the country, North and South, right after the division, because people wanted to have a unified Korea. In the North, they were recognized as legitimate organizations, these people's committees. In the South, right away, the U.S. sided with people put in power, people who had collaborated with the Japanese colonialists, Korean police who had been trained by and, you know, used by the Japanese colonialists as police. These were the people who were running the government and running the police. And they saw, the U.S. saw these people's committees as communist-inspired and would not allow them to operate. And so he drove a lot of the sort of pro-independence, pro-unification forces, you know, underground, and eventually it became in the South in the late 40s. There was like civil war basically throughout the South. You know, leftists fighting against this right-wing government. And 1947, for example, on the southern island of Jeju, the largest island in Korea, the whole island voted. There was a plebiscite in 1948 where the whole island voted against dividing the country, which the President Syngman Rhee wanted to do. And right away, there was a small revolt against the occupiers of the island, who were these police who had collaborated with the Japanese. And the U.S. immediately saw this as, like, you know, some communist-inspired revolt, declared the whole island Red Island, and oversaw a counterinsurgency campaign in which 30,000 to 40,000 people were killed. So, you know, all this kind of led up to the formation of two different states. First, South Korea declared itself Republic of Korea. And then after that, North Korea formed the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, after there was an official South Korea formed. And there was tensions along the border. And, you know, June 1950, Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, decided the time was ripe to, in his view, to liberate the whole country from the U.S. And then they made a decision, Truman made a decision to actually send U.S. forces and South Korean forces north and to occupy the North. To roll back communism, that was the idea then. And the problem with not having a democracy in South Korea is that this story has been covered up, how this came to be, until the late 80s. People couldn't even know their own history. And then, like I was saying before, under this national security law, if you started, you know, retelling the history and it sounded like North Korean history, you could be arrested under the national security law. So it's really difficult to even come to grips with your own history there.
The death and destruction caused by the U.S. empire in the Korean War, what were the targets, tactics, and how many people were killed?
It's hard to say how many people were killed. I mean, I've heard, like, you know, upwards of 3 million civilians were killed. You know, I think 3 to 4 million Koreans were killed. But they bombed everything they could bomb. I mean, they would strafe, you know, railroad, anything moving on the ground, railroads, trucks, anything like that. Everything was open to blow up. And they dropped, you know, millions and millions of barrels of napalm. I mean, they really perfected the use of napalm in Korea, in northern Korea. And so they just, you know, they would just attack towns and villages. You know, everything was considered, you know, enemy territory. So it was up for bombing. And they would just bomb everything they possibly could. And there was, you know, towards the end of the war, the U.S. Air Force actually stopped sending sorties because there was no targets left. I mean, it was really completely flattened. And, you know, the U.S. was actually thinking they came very close to dropping nuclear weapons on North Korea. And General MacArthur was finally removed from his command, in part because he wanted to nuke 20 Chinese cities, you know.
And people say today the DPRK is obsessed with its military might, right? It keeps building up the military, and they're just this military state that's completely belligerent. But Seems like there's a direct correlation to the complete devastation. I mean, 30% of its population.
They remember that. It's part of their national mythology. I mean, you know, we have our Civil War, we have our Revolutionary War, they have the Korean War, and they would consider it a war of liberation. And they did, you know, they did, with the help of the Chinese, kick the U.S. out of the North. So, you know, they don't want that to ever happen again. And yeah, that's part of their national psyche.